Have you ever stopped to think about what would happen if a good, just man who never hurt anyone lost everything overnight? It sounds like a scene from a movie, but it's in the Bible, more specifically in the book of Job. And it's not just an old story, it's a true lesson about human suffering, about keeping faith in the midst of pain and understanding that often the heavens are silent, but they are not indifferent. The spiritual tension between God and Satan is one of the most impressive details of this narrative. Few people know, but before everything happened to Job, there was a conversation in heaven. Angels and Satan presented themselves before God, and in the midst of this heavenly meeting, it was Job's name that came up, a man of integrity, faithful and God-fearing. And that was exactly why he was tested. The interesting thing is that this episode is not just about Job. It is about me, you, and anyone who, at some point in their life, feels like they have lost their footing. Job's story is about losing, suffering, but mainly about not giving up. It is about questioning, venting, but not abandoning integrity. And the most beautiful thing, even when everything seemed meaningless, he continued to believe because he knew that God's justice never fails. That's why I invite you to watch this video until the end, because the way Job reacted to his trials when everything he had was taken away, when even his friends accused him and the heavens remained silent, will make you see suffering in the Bible and in life in a completely different way. And I guarantee you, after hearing what Job did, your view of faith and hope will never be the same again. In the book of Job, right in the first chapter, the Bible makes a point of presenting this character in an admirable light. Job was described as an upright, God-fearing man who shunned evil. In other words, he was a kind of person who, even when surrounded by riches, did not let vanity take over. Those who knew him saw firsthand the importance of Job's integrity. He was not just good in appearance, he was good in essence. And look at the prosperity he had in abundance. Biblical tradition says that Job owned thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and servants. In addition, he was a father of 10 children who enjoyed an abundance and comfortable life. At that time, material prosperity was seen as a sign of divine approval. And, in fact, everything indicated that God's justice rested upon that blessed house. But Job was not only a successful farmer, he was also the priest of his own household. He had a habit of rising early and offering burnt offerings to God on behalf of his children, just in case any of them had sinned in thought or deed. This shows how, in the biblical tradition, the head of the household carried the spiritual responsibility of the household. Job's integrity was not just his own, extended it to those he loved. It is interesting to see how this story, even though it is so old, speaks to us today. How many people, even when they are prosperous, forget their essence? Job was a living example of faith in the midst of prosperity, a testimony of faith that, even without knowing what was to come, was already concerned about keeping his house under God's blessing. And it is precisely this upright profile that would attract the attention of heaven, and also of Satan. The book of Job contains one of the most intriguing scenes in biblical tradition, a meeting in heaven. The angels present themselves before God, and among them, lo and behold, there was Satan. It is interesting to note how the text makes it clear that Satan circulated among men, observing and looking for someone to accuse. This spiritual tension between God and Satan already showed that something important was about to happen. God then makes a point of exalting Job's integrity. He points to that righteous man and asks, "Have you considered my servant Job? A blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil." This phrase carries much more than praise. It reveals how someone's testimony of faith and upright conduct can echo in heaven. Job's story, even before the trials, was already an example of faith in the midst of tranquility. This is where Satan, with his cunning, raises the accusation, does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, he suggests that Job's faith only exists because everything in his life is going well. This speech begins one of the oldest dilemmas about human suffering. Can faith endure when the blessing is gone? The tension between God and Satan turns into a true spiritual test, putting Job's integrity to the test. So, God allows Satan to touch everything Job has, with one condition: preserve his life. This detail is important because it reveals that even in the moments of tribulation of the righteous, there are limits established by God's justice. And this heavenly permission makes it clear that no trial happens without a purpose. This is the kind of passage that makes us reflect on the invisible behind the scenes that we often do not know about. Soon after God's permission, Job's trials begin to unfold with a heart-wrenching intensity. First, Job loses his material possessions, his flocks, servants, and riches disappear in the blink of an eye. It's a shock that makes anyone rethink their life and question the justice of the world. But what's most impressive is Job's reaction, who, even in the face of so much loss and suffering, maintains his firm faith. The tragedy does not stop there. In an even more devastating disaster, all of Job's children die at once. The pain of family loss surpasses any human measure. It is at this point that the story shows us God's silence, that moment when it seems that heaven is empty and human suffering dominates the scene. Job tears his cloak and shaves his head, visible signs of his affliction. But even so, he does not curse the Lord. This is one of the most profound lessons in the book of Job's patience in the face of affliction and tragedy. He kneels, worships God, and acknowledges divine sovereignty even in the midst of a storm. This attitude is not simple resignation, but true testimony of faith that inspires us to this day. Job teaches us that losing everything does not mean losing hope or abandoning the integrity of our hearts. This moment marks the beginning of a spiritual trial that will challenge Job in every way, body, mind, and soul. It is the kind of tribulation of the righteous that few can understand, but it brings a powerful message about how to act when life seems to conspire against us. Job's story, despite the affliction, is a light in the darkness of human suffering. After witnessing Job's unshakable faith despite his initial losses, God and Satan meet again in heaven for a new conversation. Satan, now even bolder, challenges him skin for skin. All that a man has will he give for his life. This phrase expresses a cruel idea that no one is faithful when pain is too much. It is a true spiritual test, where Job's integrity will be tested on deeper levels. God, however, maintains his trust in the upright man and allows Satan to go further, authorizing him to touch Job's health, but without taking his life. It is a clear limit that shows God's justice even in the face of the tribulation of the righteous. This permission may seem harsh, but reveals how trials have a greater purpose, which goes beyond immediate suffering and seeks a deeper transformation. This second meeting in heaven highlights the silence of God, who, despite appearing absent, is attentive to human suffering. It is not an absence of indifference, but a space for faith to grow stronger in the midst of pain. Job will be challenged to maintain his patience and integrity even when everything around him seems to be falling apart. And that is when the real story begins to unfold. For us, this episode serves as a reminder that difficult times do not happen by chance. They are part of the biblical tradition of trials and spiritual growth. As a mentor who understands the pains of life, I can say that maintaining faith in these moments is an exercise that requires courage, patience, and a hope that goes beyond the visible. With divine permission, Job's trials take on a new chapter of physical suffering. Painful sores begin to cover his body, bringing not only physical pain, but also humiliation and isolation. Sitting in ashes and using a piece of clay to scratch himself, Job finds himself faced with a situation that many of us fear to face. This image is a powerful metaphor for human suffering, which can affect all aspects of life. Even in the midst of this torment, Job's faith remains firm in the midst of his pain. His wife, overcome with despair, encourages him to curse God and give up on life. But Job, despite his anguish, rebukes this advice and shows a strength that few understand: integrity of heart in the midst of affliction. He reminds us that the tribulation of the righteous may be heavy, but giving up is not the way. This part of the story brings us face to face with God's silence. It is as if at that moment, the sky was closed and divine answers were slow to arrive. Job feels alone, but at the same time, he does not abandon his faith. It is a real proof of what Job's patience means, not only to endure, but to maintain hope despite the outburst and anguish. For those who are facing difficult times, this chapter brings a valuable lesson. Suffering in the Bible is not romanticized, it is experienced intensely. But at the same time, it is shown as a path to growth and transformation. Job teaches us that even when all seems lost, integrity and faith can be the foundation for true recovery. After a deep silence that lasted 7 days and 7 nights, during which Job's afflictions seem to take up all the space. The three friends arrive: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They appear not only as figures of comfort, but also as representatives of the traditional view of suffering in the Biblia view that often judges before understanding. It is a scene full of expectation and tension. At first, the atmosphere is one of emotion and respect. They sit with Job in silence, showing that sometimes silence is the best medicine for the afflicted. This simple but powerful gesture reminds us how important it is to sympathize with the afflicted rather than offering ready-made answers. God's silence is reflected in the attitude of the friends, who will later spark intense debates. The arrival of these three friends opens the way for a confrontation between different understandings of the tribulation of the righteous. They represent the biblical tradition that relates suffering to sin, and their speeches will challenge Job to explain his integrity in the face of pain. This moment is crucial because it shows that human suffering raises profound questions, often without easy answers. It is in this dynamic that the book of Job presents us with a true testimony of faith and patience. While his friends debate, Job struggles to maintain his integrity and not let himself be brought down by the accusations. This scenario invites us to reflect on how to deal with the suffering of others with empathy and care, without hasty judgments, because we do not always know what is going on behind the pain. After days of silence, Job finally breaks his silence with a heartfelt and painful outburst. He curses the day of his birth, expressing a sadness so intense that many can relate. This sentiment reflects human suffering in its rawest form, the wish that he had never existed in order to avoid the pain he is experiencing. It is an honest expression of conflicting grief and hope. Job even wishes that death would be a relief, a definitive rest from so much suffering. This does not mean that he has completely lost faith, but it reveals the depth of the internal torment he was experiencing. This moment in the book of Job is a powerful reminder that Job's patience is not synonymous with the absence of pain, but with endurance in the midst of despair. His speech opens up space for an important reflection on how we face suffering. We often avoid talking about real pain, preferring empty words and superficial consolations. But Job teaches us that venting is part of the healing process, and that even when venting, it is possible to maintain an honest dialogue with God and with oneself. This chapter serves as an invitation for each of us to acknowledge our own struggles without fear or shame. Job's story is a testament to faith that embraces suffering, that does not pretend that everything is okay, but that seeks meaning even when the heavens seem silent. And that is where Job's journey continues, making room for the arrival of his friends and the debates that will come. Eliphaz, the first to speak, delivers a discourse based on tradition and his own spiritual experiences. He recalls Job's good deeds, acknowledging his integrity, but then immediately argues that suffering is a direct consequence of sin. This view reflects an ancient wisdom that associates justice with immediate retribution, a common idea at the time, but one that makes us wonder whether suffering is always punishment. In his speech, Eliphaz shares a spiritual vision he had, reinforcing the human limitations in the face of divine mysteries. He suggests that, instead of complaining, Job should seek God and accept discipline as part of learning. This speech brings to light the tension between the human desire for answers and the silence of heaven in the face of tribulations. Despite his critical tone, Eliphaz tries to show a path of hope, arguing that restoration only comes with humility and repentance. He acts as a typical counselor who believes in the principle of God's justice, but his message may sound harsh to those in the midst of deep distress. It is an invitation to reflect on how to speak to those who suffer without judgment. This moment in the book of Job challenges us to consider the words we choose to comfort and also to understand complexities of human suffering. The ancient wisdom that Eliphaz presents is valuable, but it needs to be balanced with compassion. And it is precisely this fine line that Job will have to walk in the following speeches. Job responds to Eliphaz with a mixture of sadness and indignation. He laments the weight of his pain, which goes far beyond what the eyes can see, and rejects the empty advice that does not take his reality into account. This moment shows the complexity of human suffering, which cannot be resolved with simplistic explanations, but requires compassion and deep understanding. When he speaks, Job asks for something that is fundamental even today, that his friends show compassion to the afflicted. Instead of judging him, He highlights the injustice of being accused while experiencing the tribulation of the righteous. This attitude reveals Job's integrity, who, even while suffering intensely, does not lose his dignity or his faith, but cries out for respect and true support. Job also expresses a feeling of isolation that many experience when they are in deep pain, the feeling of being watched, pressured, and misunderstood. He wants God to leave him alone, even if it means dying, because anguish consumes him. This outburst is a legitimate expression of someone who experiences God's silence and seeks answers in the midst of chaos. This response reminds us that faith does not mean passively accepting whatever happens, but can include sincere questioning and honest outbursts. The story of Job, more than ever, invites us to see suffering through human eyes, so that we can offer more love and less judgment. Bildad takes a more severe tone, criticizing Job's complaints and suggesting that suffering is a consequence of a hidden sin. For him, the death of Job's children would be a just divine punishment, reinforcing a traditional view of God's justice that associates affliction with punishment. This stance brings to light one of the greatest challenges of suffering in the Bible, the difficulty in understanding the reason for the pain. He appeals to ancient wisdom, reminding us that the righteous will be restored and the wicked destroyed. Bildad uses strong imagery to explain the fate of those who turn away from God, seeking to give a moral meaning to human suffering. However, his arguments may sound harsh to those who are in the tribulation of the righteous, as they seem to ignore the complexity of the pain experienced by Job. Bildad insists that if Job humbles himself and seeks God sincerely, all will be restored, as an invitation to repent and seek relief, despite his intention to help. His speech reinforces the idea that suffering is a direct consequence of sin, something that Job knows is not true for himself. This confrontation between friend and sufferer is part of what makes this story so powerful. This moment in the book of Job makes us reflect on how we often quickly judge the pain of others, applying absolute truths without understanding the situation. The ancient wisdom that Bildad brings is value, but it needs to be balanced with compassion and empathy. And Job will continue his dialogue, seeking to explain that his integrity remains intact, even in the midst of trials. Job responds to Bildad by acknowledging God's greatness, but questioning the logic that automatically associates suffering with sin. He expresses the anguish of being constantly watched and tested, showing that suffering is not simply the result of personal failures. This questioning turns the story into a profound debate about God's justice and the mystery of human suffering. Furthermore, Job speaks of the loneliness that accompanies the afflicted suffering without consolation and being misunderstood by those who should help. His voice reveals a sincere outburst, the fruit of Job's patience that has already been tested to the limit. He only wishes that God would leave him in peace before he dies, a request that shows the weight of the tribulation of the righteous and the silence of heaven. This response emphasizes that Job's integrity remains firm, even in the face of speeches that unjustly accuse him. He does not give up his faith, but asks that suffering be understood in a more human way, without hasty judgments. It is an invitation for us to be more compassionate and less quick to condemn when dealing with the pain of others. Thus, the dialogue between Job and his friends reveals deep layers of suffering in the Bible, showing that the answers are not always simple. This complexity enriches the biblical tradition and offers valuable lessons for those facing similar challenges today. Job's journey continues, showing that integrity in the face of trial is a true victory. The cycle of debates between Job and his friends reveals a deep conflict between different ways of understanding human suffering. Despite the accusations and harsh speeches, Job maintains his Job-like integrity, a true example of faith in the midst of pain that inspires even today. He does not let himself be defeated by words, showing that Job's patience is more than resistance, it is a posture of hope. This first phase of the book of Job shows that suffering in the Bible is not simplified or treated with ready-made answers. On the contrary, it is complex and often involves God's silence and deep questions. The story of Job invites us to look at Job's trials as a mirror of our own tribulations, where faith is tested and strengthened. We also learn that in the tribulation of the righteous, companionship and understanding are essential. The friend's speeches warn us about the danger of hasty judgments, and Job's stance teaches us the importance of maintaining integrity even when the world around us seems to be uncomprehending. It's a delicate balance that resonates in real life. Thus, The narrative remains open, leaving us with the expectation of what will come next. Job remains a man of integrity, even in adversity, and his testimony of faith challenges anyone facing loss and suffering. The journey is just beginning, and divine answers are yet to come. Now that you know about the profound journey of Job, a man who lost everything, faced unimaginable suffering, but never lost his faith and integrity, the question remains, how have you dealt with your own trials? Can you maintain the hope and patience that transform your life in the face of loss and pain? Reflect on the lessons from the book of Job and ask yourself, when in your life, can you choose faith in the midst of pain instead of despair? What practical steps can you take to strengthen your patience and maintain integrity, even when the heavens seem silent? If this story touched your heart and brought insights for your journey, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll find more content that will strengthen your faith, your hope, and your ability to overcome any tribulation. Join this community that seeks to grow spiritually and transform suffering into learning. Job's testimony is an invitation for you to never give up, no matter how difficult it may seem. Let's continue this journey together.